courage to your skis. Welcome, everyone. We are just thrilled to have an almost capacity crowd for this wonderful, wonderful evening. And if you come on in and grab a seat wherever you like, we are so pleased. This is our second of what has already become a famous series, and we'll have one more. The next month we'll take a holiday break and then start again in January with our speaker series. Can't promise our patio will be finished by our November, by the third Thursday in November, but certainly in the new year, get ready for something splendid outside to welcome you the next time you come in the new year for a speaker series. Hopefully you'll be here before then. I am Julia Chambers. I am the new Executive Director of the Channel Islands Maritime Museum. And thank you again for coming. And I would like to welcome a guy everybody knows, Bill Conroy, who will be telling us a little bit about our speaker tonight, and then introduce our speaker. So thank you so much, Bill.
It's a real pleasure for me to introduce our speaker. He's no stranger to the museum. He's been working with the museum for 10 years now, and he brought some wonderful information to the museum. You're going to hear all about his story here, and I don't want to give it away, but he just did a great job. Now, in his day job, he works at Morgan Stanley in the big building over on the other side of Oceanside. So if you're looking for some good advice, he's the guy to go talk to. But I don't want to just hold this up, but because I want to hear what Howard has to say. And I'll just introduce him. Howard Smith, friend of the museum, and a person who's going to tell you all about China. Thanks, Howard.
I haven't done this lecture in about 2 years, so if I stumble through the beginning, bear with me. But the history of this goes back. Actually, I'm going to try that. Can you hear me without the microphone?
No.
Okay, just hard to do this dance with both of these. Again, thank you very much for coming out tonight. What I'm going to be telling you is a story about the greatest navy in the world that you've never heard of, and why you never heard of it, and what the impact of all of that is. As Bill mentioned, I moonlight as a stockbroker for Morgan Stanley. But many years ago, I was an Asian Studies major, studied Chinese, lived in Singapore for a year, studied at Nanyang College there. And at one point in my life, before I discovered I was dyslexic, I was actually fluent in Chinese. I've lost most of that now. That's going back more than 40 years. But the origin of this story, we're kind of coming full circle back to the museum, is about 10 years ago, I was having lunch with the former director, Mark Mason. And a new book had come out called 1421 at that point. That was the book. Called The Year China Discovered America. And Mark and I were talking about it, and he said, you know, we don't have anything on Asia in the museum. And at some point down the road, we're going to be expanding into our new building, which we're now finally in the new building, which is great news for the museum itself. Anyway, and all we have is this one Korean turtle boat, and we really want to do stuff on Asia. And I've decided, since you're interested in China, and you're a relatively smart guy, as I said no, you're going to be the curator for an exhibit on our Chinese fleet and the 1421 stuff. And he said, I'll help you, but you're going to become a curator. I've never been a curator before. It's actually a lot of fun being a curator. If you ever get a chance to put a museum exhibit together, do it. It's a lot of fun. And you get to work with great people, particularly here at this museum. Anyway, so Mark got me together with some other people from the Chinese American Association in Ventura County. They're a historian, and we started researching. And we spent about almost 2 years doing research on this, just trying to figure out what the fleets had done, what we might do for the museum. And we suddenly realized that in 2005, the 600th anniversary of the first voyage of the treasure fleet was going to take place. It was also going to be celebrated around the world, throughout all of Asia, and the Middle East as well, and parts of Africa, where the Chinese had traveled to. And we decided we needed to race forward and put together this exhibit about about the museum, about the fleets, and try to get it into 2005. We actually opened December 3rd of 2005, and the exhibit ran for 6 months. Bill, who just introduced me, actually built the model that's downstairs, along with some other people, of the Chinese treasure ship. It's actually gorgeous. He did it plank by plank by plank. It's an incredibly impressive thing. But anyway, this was the entryway to the exhibit. If you recognize those lions, those of you who've been to the Tower Club, they lend us the lions that are there. The gate was meant to sort of replicate the Forbidden City, the colors of the Forbidden City. We had an artist who had done the China Wall in Ventura come down. He did that portrait, that portrait of Zheng He, which I believe this copy is hanging in the museum. Put that together, gave us the color scheme, did a lot of wonderful work. So it all came together really quickly and really successfully. And I think, and maybe someone will correct me, it was the most successful exhibit, most well-attended exhibit the museum had ever put together in its history. And it brought a lot of attention to the museum that people didn't even know we were here. And I tried to encourage that because I'm a member of a lot of other organizations. At the time, I was also chairman of the Economic Development Association of Ventura County for 3 years. And every time I spoke, I talked about the fleet, but I did it in a way that was relevant to the people there. And that's kind of the first question I want to talk about tonight is, why are we all here? Why am I up front? Why are you sitting in the back? And the fact of the matter is, the reason we don't know about this fleet is that it was eventually shut down and canceled and the records destroyed in one of the greatest blunders in all modern history. And it is the reason we all speak English today in this continent and not Chinese. And there's a lesson in this, that it was shut down for purely partisan reasons, infighting between the Chinese government, and that sounds familiar to you. It is what is happening in this country today. So history always repeats itself, just in different forms, and hopefully you'll pay attention, you'll talk to your legislators and say, hey, this is what happened in the past, let's not let this happen today. Anyway, Admiral Zheng He, picture of him up here, and that painting, he was, again, probably one of the greatest explorers of all time, far beyond the exploits of Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Magellan, all the people that we've heard about. But we never heard about him because the bad guy, who you can meet in a while, ordered all the records destroyed. 90% of them were destroyed. Not everything was destroyed, though. And there was enough that modern historians have been able to recreate what was going on. And to sort of understand this history, you need to understand, hopefully, there we go. You need to understand a little bit about China at the time. In 1405, again, this is, almost a century before Columbus, China was one entity, one nation, whereas Europe was like several hundred individual little petty kingdoms. China was one entity, had the world's largest armies, the world's largest navies, and was the technologically most sophisticated country in the world. They had invented gunpowder, the compass, mapping, astronomy to a degree that the West would not know for another couple hundred years. What they had done up to that point in time was astonishing. The Forbidden City, which you see here, was built in that same time by a gentleman known as the Third Emperor of China, or Zhu Di. That's a painting of him. Zhu Di, in the short time he was ruling, built the Forbidden City, rebuilt the Great Wall of China, and built the Grand Canal. And he was opposed later on by, this is our evil hero, I should say hero, this is our evil antagonist. This is the man who 30 years later destroyed the fleets. His name is Lu Daxia. We know him. He was the chief mandarin. And to understand a little bit about China, you have to know they had a very sophisticated government system where the mandarins were the administrators of the government. They'd been in power at this point for 1,200 years. And they existed as a working class of bureaucrats right up until the beginning of the 20th century when the Sun Yat-sen government was overthrown by the communists. that you took an exam. If you passed that exam, you became a Mandarin official. Extremely hard exam, but it was the difference between poverty and success in China at that point in time. The Mandarins were opposed in government power by the admirals and generals, and both groups reported directly to the emperor. And they were in competition, and usually there was a relative balance of power. However, things started to change. Now, this is a picture of the Nina, a replica, one that actually visited Channel Islands Harbor 4 or 5 years ago. And you can see how small this is. It was maybe 60 feet long. And not usually, didn't have great capacity, great trading capacity. And you got to think, the Chinese ships, which we'll show you later, were 400 feet long. They were 150 feet wide. You could have fit 3 of these across the deck, just about in a Chinese ship of the same era. This is Magellan's boat, the Victoria, that returned from, it was the only ship of 7 that returned from an around-the-world voyage in around 1511. That one little tiny ship contained enough spices, cinnamon, cloves, and so forth, from the East Indies, that it basically balanced the entire budget of Spain. It was like bringing uranium back from the moon, not that appreciating it. But it was incredibly valuable in an era before refrigeration. You needed spices to preserve food. And that one ship had enough to propel Spain into leadership of all of Europe and get their money going. So here's another shot of Victoria. These are typical spices from India. I have to give credit to my stepdaughter who took these pictures in India. And if you read, these books are out. This is Diary of Columbus. This is also Magellan's book. If you read these books, in both cases, and this is where Western historians have always had a lot of problem, in both cases, Magellan and Columbus are referring to charts and maps they had seen that showed a different world, a new world in their language, but places that no European had ever been before. And Gavin Menzies, who wrote the book, 1421, Gavin made a lot of mistakes in his book. It's a fascinating book. I encourage you to read it, but know it's full of errors, mistakes, which he's trying to correct in subsequent editions. But he went looking for, after reading these books, he went looking for those charts and maps, and who could have possibly done it. Now, Gavin himself was a former British naval commander who piloted submarines around the world. He had a periscope view of the world, and he understood charts and currents better than most other historians ever do. And he realized when he was doing this research, he originally thought it was the Portuguese fishermen who might have ventured out into the North Atlantic and created these maps and charts, but he realized even that was not possible. They didn't exist. Where he finally realized they didn't exist with the Chinese, and that's what started his investigation into the fleets. This is one of several very early maps. You kind of see, this is the outline of South America down here. Here's the Horn of Africa, Europe over there. And up here you'll see various islands. Now remember, no one had plotted these islands before, and most historians in the past would simply dismiss it as saying, oh, these are works of fiction, fantasy, that were just thrown in there to make it interesting. Except the charts and maps that showed this stuff were very accurate. They actually have detailed maps of islands in the Caribbean that existed before any European was there. In fact, if you read Magellan's diary, he's looking for the straits that will later bear his name because he saw them on a chart and he thought that was the venue to get to Asia. And he was looking for those things. He didn't discover them in that sense. They were already there. He knew he was looking for them. Columbus, the same thing as well. So the Chinese, catch up here. Before the Ming, the Chinese had been making routine voyages all over Asia. This is more from the city. These are the treasure ships you'll see on the horizon. Again, these are 450 feet long. And the Chinese didn't just have one of these, they had fleets of these, 30 and 40 of these, surrounded by hundreds of other smaller ships. And they were the first navy in the world to invent the concept of a fleet. Up until the 20th century, most European navies, they had, every ship contained everything. It had guns, it had its ammo, it had its food, it had soldiers, it had horses, it had water. Chinese didn't do that. They had military boats, horse boats, treasure boats for fighting, for carrying stuff, and fighting ships and so forth. They also pioneered certain types of construction. This is from a 12th century boat, and had triple plank construction in this concept. And this is the construction of a replica of one of the Chinese fleets in the exact same harbor where the treasure ships were built 600 years before. And this is a replica that China built for the Olympics. It's a non-floating one, and it's a half size of one of the treasure ships, but drawn to scale. Now this guy, this is Marco Polo. And Marco Polo, you've all heard of, he traveled to China in the 12th century, again about 200 years before the period we're talking about. What most people don't remember is that he returned to Europe by sea on Chinese ships. And the Chinese were actually delivering a princess, a daughter of the emperor, to Saudi Arabia to marry an Arab prince. So they've been in communication for thousands of years, going through this whole area, routinely sailing the Indian Ocean with their ships to an extent that Europeans could not even fathom. Now, Zheng He is the admiral who we're going to be talking most about tonight. His birth name was San Bao, and his father and his grandfather were Muslims, and part of the pledge of being Muslim was to travel to Mecca at one point in your life, which he eventually did do as part of this fleet. When he was 11, this is Yunnan province, the gate to his community, pretty good. And this is part of the temples that we prayed at. Anyway, when he was 11, he was captured in war. He was turned into a eunuch. No males were ever allowed to serve inside the Forbidden City without being turned into a eunuch for fear that they would impregnate one of the royal princesses. They're very protective of the royal line. So good luck if you want to work in government. And so he ended up working for this man, Zhu Di, who was a prince at the time when Zheng He was captured. And Zhu Di became the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty. He was a ruthless but very effective ruler. As I said, he had his armies conquered most of China, united it. He built that Forbidden City. Many of you probably have been there and seen all these things. And then this is the Grand Canal. This canal is 1,000 miles long. It goes from Nanjing in the south to Beijing in the north, because the Forbidden City in Beijing did not exist except for a little village before he was in power. But he needed to ship food and materials up there, so he built a 1,000-mile canal to do that. Some more shots of the canal. He also rebuilt and fortified the Great Wall of China. This is an old section from a photograph taken when I was in China many years ago. But you got a picture, a wall stretching from the Atlantic coast across the entire Canadian border to Canada, with side extensions running down to Chicago, Milwaukee, and so forth. An enormous civic undertaking that he built to protect China from the barbarians to the north. So, he also, for various reasons, decided to create the fleet. And what he wanted to do was improve trade with East Asia and throughout the Indian Ocean on a scale not before seen even by the Chinese. So he commissioned the fleet, and he appointed Zheng He to be his admiral. That's Zheng He. And this is a postage stamp from Singapore that came out in 2005 celebrating the fleets. And again, in the middle, you'll see the treasure ship, and you'll see all the other different ships surrounding it. Here's the admiral again. This is the shipyard in China, just south of Nanjing. It still exists to this day where these ships were built. It's part of the shipyard complex. And this is a comparison, scale comparison, of the treasure ship and Vasco da Gama ship here. And if you go downstairs and you see the model, and by the way, like I said, Bill Conroy built that ship, incredible piece of work. You'll see a sample of the Santa Maria, Columbus's other ship, next to it. And it's very similar in size and shape to that. So you can imagine the amount of wealth, again, other different artists doing the same thing. Another comparison. And then here's ours. That's the ship Bill built, and that's the Santa Maria right there. And back there you see another shot later on of the Cutty Star, which was a state-of-the-art clipper ship from the 1880s, 1890s, which is one of the fastest ships ever built. Still, to this day, I believe it's in London. It was in a fire real recently. They're nothing, literally nothing compared to what the Chinese are doing. So the voyages began. There were actually 7 of them altogether, and they would start in China. This is a rudder that was dug up from those shipyards, and when they engineered it backwards, this rudder fit a ship 450 feet long. That's it. And one of our members of the team was in China. He has a business there, and he took all these photographs of these things, and it's just lying outside in the museum. Completely unprotected, but there it was. You know, a 600-year-old piece of wood. That's the tiller portion of it. And again, these are some of the varieties of ships, some for horses, some for fighting, some for soldiers, some for water, some for quick transport, and so on down the line. Infinite variety of ships. As I said, the Chinese had also invented the compass. They knew longitude and latitude 300 years before the Europeans. They could calculate it at sea. These voyages had as many as 30,000 people traveling together. They included not just sailors, but doctors, scientists, researchers, cooks, you name it, they were all there, going together. And the map they use, those of you, anybody here old enough to remember AAA triptychs? Right? You always went in a straight line, the world could change. Well, this is the way they did their maps. And this one hangs in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. You would start here, go to the end, then pick up here, continue, and so on and so forth. And down here, you'll see another picture later on, that were the stars that you would see. So you could also aid in navigation. And this was a modern version of that we had at the museum exhibit. And so here was the triptych version, and here's what it would look like on a regular map. So you kind of get a sense of the comparison. That'll work. And this is a page for one of the Chinese navigation guides. Again, you see the constellations up here, and then the instructions, and so forth over there. This is from Joseph Needham, almost 78 years ago, writing about the Chinese and talking about these maps. And again, this is a Korean map from the same era that was done by the Chinese for the Emperor of Korea. And you can see, even though it's surely not up to what we call our standard, that's the old Korean peninsula. This is China. Down here, this would be Hong Kong and so forth, the islands, Indonesia. And this would be probably India here, there's some sort of unknown area marking. Or Burma, maybe Thailand over here, not exactly sure. But again, this is what they were doing. Down here, you can't see the faded characters, but that's what the instructions would do. So again, these 7 voyages typically would start here, Changi or Taikan. They would go to the Philippines, Cambodia, all throughout here, Ceylon, Ormuz, Mecca, East Africa, and so forth. And why were they going? Well, as they travel these different places, they were both bringing trade goods. And again, these are from the exhibit we did back in 2005. These are various Ming Dynasty plates, pottery, and so forth that the Chinese were selling overseas. And again, the Chinese, with their large army, they could have been conquerors. They could have set up colonies, but they didn't. They kind of echo this line today, I don't know whether we believe them or not, saying they were not interested in world conquest, they were interested in trade and commerce. And that's exactly what they did. They could have dominated these countries, but they didn't even try. They simply traveled for trade purposes. So here are more of the trade goods. These are the silks they might pick up along the way in India and sell in East Asia or Middle East. These are them approaching Thailand. This is in Thailand. This is a cave painting in Thailand of a Chinese ship coming through. This is a temple in Indonesia. One of the things that the Chinese bring such wealth to these areas that Zheng He became revered almost as a god. And so there were temples set up, Chinese temples. Now Chinese tend to be Buddhist, Confucianist, Taoist. Zheng He himself was a Muslim, but yet they set up Buddhist temples in his honor. And then the fleet would sail on around Malaysia, Indonesia, Borneo, and so forth, and would trade with the kingdoms there. This is modern day textile workers doing the same work. This is a guy making tin out of that material in his hand. Again, another temple celebrating recently the 600th anniversary in Indonesia. A Zheng He temple, also in Indonesia. From there they would sail on to India, and here they are trading in India. And here, in what is now Ceylon or Sri Lanka, this is a tablet that was translated in 5 different languages, Chinese, whatever the Hindu variation was there, and a few others, all describing how Zheng He came there in trade and settled the dispute between the warring factions in Sri Lanka and resolved it. Well, that war is actually still going on today in Sri Lanka. But this is a reminder that some of these things do go on forever, and that they don't always get resolved, but that he was there, and he was respected for that effort. Then from there they moved on to India. And again, they hit the Indian markets for trading, all kinds of goods. They also introduced what are known to this day as Chinese fishing nets. It's a unique system using levers and pulleys of dropping nets into the water, catching fish and pulling them out with a minimum of effort. Very sophisticated, and they still work in this area of India to this day. And they sailed on. And they would go to the Middle East and trade there as well. This is the old city of Hormuz, which was a great trading center back in the Middle Ages. This was on the road to Mecca. These are ruined mosques. We actually didn't have tobacco back then, but it kind of looked like a cool picture. They were trading something. Tobacco goods. But again, carpets, brassware, goods like this, all being traded. Here's Mecca. Zheng He did make it there. From there, they sailed on to East Asia. And they, again, you have the Somali warlords and the pirates there. There were pirates there then. They fought the pirates then, at that time, and again, tried to impose peace treaties with them. These are some of the pirates in that area fighting. This is making batik fabric that they would pick up and bring back to China. This is cutting up fish and drying them, which they would bring back to China as well as one of the products they would do. Still going on. And this is a giraffe. Well, could you picture trying to put this giraffe on a 60-foot yacht? Ain't gonna happen. Well, this giraffe was brought back to China on one of those ships. Actually, a pair were brought back. The Chinese thought they were mystical animals. In fact, they were just plain old giraffes. But they're big. Well, how do you get a giraffe to China? You got a very big boat to do it. So, again, after 7 voyages, Zheng He died at sea in, I think, 1431, 1432. He was a eunuch, but he did carry his privates around in a bag around his neck. And that is what is buried in that tomb back in China. The rest of him was buried at sea. And this was the temple dedicated to him at his burial site. But again, you have all of these incredible accomplishments. Completely lost here in my notes, so pardon me. Okay. Anyway, so the Mandarins were in power, and what was happening is you can imagine the staggering amount of wealth that was coming into China from all of these voyages. This is the Emperor, Zhuge, and those of you who've been to the Forbidden City and have gone north to the Ming tombs, that is our emperor right there. This was excavated about 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and now lines a roadway along with some of these other animals. And this is a map of the tomb of the Ming Emperor north of Beijing. Anyway, when he died, his son and then eventually his grandson took over and became the new emperor. And this man, Liu Daxia, who was again the chief mandarin, was livid that the admirals and generals had accumulated so much wealth over the preceding 30 years of these 7 voyages. And he decided to do something about it, because he didn't want them overweighing his authority. So he's the man that ordered in one fell swoop the destruction of the fleet, which he did accomplish, the banning of all shipping of any sort leaving mainland China, with the exception of local offshore fishing vessels. And again, the law was always flouted, whatever that word is, ignored, but not to any great extent. And he had most of the records burned, which is a great Chinese tradition of getting rid of history. You burn everybody else's records. But enough did survive. Now, what happened is, there's speculation, and this is where Menzies gets kind of interesting, that these charts and maps, through various means, made their way back to Europe in the mid-15th century. And that Prince Henry the Navigator, who was the ruler of Portugal, set up his sailing school and commissioned Vasco da Gama to sail around Africa, and they believe the Chinese maps were used in this. We have no proof of that, but there's a lot of speculation, and it's an open question. Maybe someday somebody will uncover Chinese junk somewhere in the Atlantic proving the thesis that they did in fact circumnavigate the world. It's entirely plausible that they could have done this. Menzies himself talks about how a friend of his in World War II was in a ship that was torpedoed off the coast of Africa, and they got into their lifeboats, and within 2 weeks they had floated on the currents straight into the West Indies, to Hispaniola and Santo Domingo and so forth. That the currents take you right across, and that even in the age of exploration, all of Europeans would sail down to this current off the Africa and then shoot across the Atlantic that way. It was the fastest way to do it. And the reverse currents they would ride coming back. The Chinese had sailed all the way down to the tip of Africa. They could have easily had the capacity to round the Cape and keep on going. Again, we don't know if they did. We also don't know if they did the same thing in the Pacific. But there's evidence, for example, how many people have not been to Lake Tahoe? Tahoe in Chinese means big lake. John Steinbeck, the writer, one of his pet theses was that the Chinese had actually come to America and had explored the West Coast. And his son has also written a book, a fiction novel about this. But one of his things he cited as evidence is first the Monterey cypress. The only other place the Monterey cypress grows is in China, naturally. And it was Steinbeck's theory that the Chinese planted the Monterey cypress along the coast of places they explored to use them as markers, because they were so distinctive and resembled no other tree they could tell where they were with a living landmark. There's also the remnants of a Chinese junk in the Sacramento Delta, I think it was before World War I. And when they're trying to clear the Delta, the Army Corps of Engineers blasted out the ship. Half of it was in the channel and half of it was buried under hundreds of feet of mud. Now, I don't know how accurate the story was, but supposedly, within the last decade, people drilled down to the wreck that was in the ground and pulled back core samples and tested them. And the theory, supposedly, I don't know if it's true or not, what they came back with wood samples and rice, and I'll explain the rice in a second, that was 600 years old. Go figure. No one knows for sure. There have also been hundreds of Chinese anchors found off the coast of Catalina, which everyone says, oh, that's from Chinese fishing vessels from the 1850s. Well, if their little tiny fishing vessels could get here in the 1850s, what's stopping a 450-foot Goliath from getting here 600 years before? Absolutely nothing. And the currents will take you here. Again, a year later, after the explosion in Fukushima, we're seeing Japanese stuff floating up on the shores of our country. The currents are amazing things. This is a map, Chinese map of the world, supposedly from mid-15th century, before Columbus, showing the entire world. It's highly debated whether this is accurate or not. This is actually a replica done in the 1600s, supposedly on an earlier map. Again, is it proof? We don't know. Now, Chinese revere Zheng He. Their very first 747 was named Zheng He, going the distance. And again, China has gone through a massive explosion and change, as we've all seen. We're kind of getting used to it at this point. When I was there in 1979 for the first time, actually the only time in China itself, this is what it looked like on the back streets. A few years later, it looked like this with motor scooters. A few years later, it looked like that. And that. And that. So, one of the great things about trade and global commerce is that when you're trading with people, you tend not to fight with them. If you do, and if we ever went to war with China, we would not end up with these. So we are absolutely linked together. And that was basically Zheng He's goal and Admiral Zhu's goal, was to do trade and commerce for the benefit of all involved. And unfortunately, you had a man whose concern was more about partisan power and destroyed this all. So, this is from the Olympics, and you'll recognize some of these things. And this is the completed 200-foot replica of the treasure ship. And there's another one being built now that is supposed to be able to sail. And I think the museum is going to attempt to try to bring it here, as we were the only museum in the United States to celebrate the 600th anniversary, the only maritime museum. Us and a tiny little thing at the Smithsonian, which was done by some volunteers, but ours was probably better. My parents saw the other one. And this, again, also from the Beijing Olympics, these people holding these up, those are the treasure ships. And that is what they were celebrating at the Olympics. We showed them up and the fleet. And there it is. So, we have a prize today. And it is donated by the museum. It is a copy of 1421. And this prize will go to the one who guesses this answer. There have been 35 or more movies made about Zheng He in Hollywood over the years. By what name is he known? Is anyone, first one to guess it, gets the book? Yes? You got it. Remember, his birth name was San Bao. And our image of this man is that. Douglas Fairbanks running around in pantaloons, sailing a little tiny ship, probably no bigger than that model there, instead of one of the greatest admirals the world has ever known. And we also had images like that. And Popeye, my favorite. Anyway, that is it. I'll open up for any question on anything related to this. And go ahead.
You said there are an awful lot of errors in 1421. I'm halfway through it. Is they proven the errors, or?
Well, let me put it this way. But Gavin, and I communicate with Gavin and his people fairly frequently. When they set out to do this, he was like an amateur detective. And he saw an anomaly in history, and he wanted to kind of figure it out. He was not a trained historian. He had no background in history. So he speculated based on what knowledge is there. So all the technical stuff is actually dead on accurate. There's also a great book that is called When China Ruled the Seas by Louise Leathers, who came out in the 90s, which is 100% accurate as you can get, describes the voyages and the ships and the nature of what was going on in China at the time. Menzies has all that background stuff. The way he goes haywire and astray is in speculating that they did these other things. That the ships, voyages, fleets split up, this guy went this way, this guy went that way, and they all reconvened back in China. That is pure speculation, and there's no real solid proof that any of that happened. There's also no proof it didn't happen. So when we look at the evidence of who could have done these things, who could have created the maps and charts that Magellan and Columbus saw, Chinese are probably the only ones.
Have they tried to, like, he bases a lot of it on the Asian chickens, presumably, in in Americas and so on. Have they done anything with DNA on that?
There's a lot of stuff being done constantly now. And again, what the greatest thing he did was trigger people's interest in this. So there's staggering amounts of research from all over the world being done. Again, for example, he points out there were horses that the Maori had in New Zealand. Well, how do you transport a horse? You don't do it in a Polynesian canoe. It is not possible. They're not big enough. They can't carry enough supplies to feed a horse on an ocean voyage. And there is some archaeological evidence that the Chinese were in New Zealand during this period. And were later, either they abandoned the settlement or they were wiped out. And he believes the horses came from the Chinese. There's a lot of DNA evidence being done. There's even a book, several books actually, very technical, very arcane, about east-west transmissions that should not have happened unless somebody physically transported things there. And so again, Gavin's speculation led people to begin research, and this stuff is happening every day. And even though I'm a stockbroker, I make a routine habit every day of checking the Science Daily website and another site called Archaeologica, because the innovations that are coming out every single day all over the world, because of our ability to communicate and transmit information about these things, is phenomenal. I mean, to get this stuff 20 years ago would have been impossible without doing laborious research. All this we did on the web, or from the books we found on the web. Photographs, I can't do this, commercially because none of these, I don't have the rights to any of these photographs. My daughter would sue me. But anyway, yeah, so there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of still anomalies out there that have yet to be explained. Yeah?
Have you read the book that deals with the Minoans and how they came all the way up to the Great Lakes to get copper and tin?
I have not, but actually Ian, who works with Gavin, is sending me a copy. So I'll see you soon.
It's a good read.
It probably is. Again, he's not a great historian. But he also did a second book, which was about what he believes was triggering the age of the Renaissance in Europe. He believes it was based on a Chinese trading mission to Venice in the 1430s. And he learned his lesson from the first book. 40% of the second book is his footnotes and his reference material. And what you have is Chinese had massive encyclopedias of all of their machines, their equipment, their mathematics, everything from a screw pump to move water from one rice field to another, to how to do astronomical plottings and charts and calculus and so forth. And somehow the Europeans, the Italians, suddenly invented all that by the end of the 15th century, after the supposed voyage was there. There's also a very high percentage of Chinese DNA in northeast Italy that there's no other explanation for than the fact that he also brought concubines to give to the emperors and rulers of the Italian city-states at that time, who worked as basically slaves in those families and had kids and who ended up marrying. So, more anomalies from history. Other questions? Yeah?
What was the time span on the first voyage to the last voyage?
1405 to 1433. 7 major voyages.
28 years.
Yep. Now, but keep in mind that the Chinese smaller vessels and traders had been traveling the Indian Ocean for hundreds and hundreds of years before that. So this was not brand new to them either. This was building on existing technology, existing knowledge, and going from there. It wasn't like, oh, let's go to places we've never been.
During that 28 period, you had 7 voyages. And how long was the voyage? 2 years, 3 years?
Something like that, yeah. Yeah, some were longer, some were shorter. They had different trade routes. I kind of smushed them all together for the purposes of the talk to give you a sense. But yeah, each one had a slightly different purpose and goal. Anybody else? Anything related to this?
It's fantastic.
Downstairs at the museum?
Yes.
Yes, and you'll also see the ship that Bill built, framed by what was once the Great Wall of China, or the Forbidden City. And I'll be around if you have other questions you want to ask. Thank you. One more.
The pictures that he, where is that though? It looks like an oil painting portrait.
It was an oil painting done for us.
Oh, wow,
Prints were made from that.
right.
And I think we gave the painting back to the artist. Is that what?
Let me take over.
Hey, thanks. I'm so pleased that Howard could come here. It reminds me so much of the work we did in 2005. Many, many hours put in together by our committee with Howard and so many other people, and it was a lot of fun putting it all together. The question about that painting, the museum now owns that painting. The artist donated it back to the museum. So we do own that, and our curator can tell you where it is. It's someplace here in the museum. Howard is very generous in his praise about the model, and we have a model builders club here, and there were 4 of us. Well, actually, helping in the original design was a fellow named Bob Little, who was sitting in the back. He was showing people around earlier, and he's our expert in ships and bottles. He's right back there. And he made a major suggestion in the design of this model ship. But then 4 other people helped me, Richard Walton, who is the president of the Model Guild right now, Dave Anderson, who's a very active volunteer. And when you see the carvings on the front of the ship, they were made by Sergio Aragones. Sergio Aragones is in our model club, and Sergio is a very famous cartoonist. He works for Mad Magazine. You may have heard of him.
Spy versus Spy, Mad Magazine.
Spy. He did all that fancy carving on the front of the museum. On the thing. Interesting thing, as we were building the model, we were building it in wood, obviously. We're putting it together. We didn't know what color to make it. And it turned out the show, or the exhibit they had in Singapore, my son actually had an opportunity to go there on a business trip. He took pictures of their model, and we copied their colors. So they know what's going on. That's great. The other thing that may have been disproved, since I really have been keeping track of what Gavin Menzies said, the one that I really like is the idea that in Newport, Rhode Island, there is a stone tower. And Gavin says that it's possible that the Zhanghe people built that tower. You'd think you could disprove that in a second, but you cannot. No one knows who built that tower. So it's things like that that are in 1421 that you could really enjoy the book. And downstairs on the counter we have that book is for sale. We have another one that is a very good book to read, When China Ruled the Seas. That's available as well, and a couple of others. So look around, and I do hope you take the opportunity to take a look at our model and our display. So this has been a wonderful evening, but I want to talk about next month. Now, on the 3rd Thursday, this is what we're going to be doing, these lectures. I hate to use the word lecture, it sounds so stiff, but these talks. And next month, we're going to be talking about, I need some light to see this. We're going to be talking about our watershed. It's all of our responsibilities to keep this water as clean as it is. And this harbor, by the way, is a beautiful, clean harbor, and it's clear. So we have, let me tell you his name, Paul Jenkins, who is the environmental director of the Surfrider Foundation, who will be talking about how we can protect our watershed and keep it as clean and clear and pristine as it is right now. So please come next. Well, I forget the date. Oh, November 21st. But it's the 3rd Thursday. It's easy to remember. So please come back on the 3rd Thursday. And by the way, you notice now we have expanded our libations and our refreshments. We now serve alcohol at our events. So feel free to have a glass of wine and have another cup of coffee. But please take the opportunity to take a look downstairs at our display and see the ship that we built for this display. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.